Thank you for joining our Imagery International program. We hope you found it stimulating. ImageryInternational.org.
Emotional Pathways. Join host Dr. Juliet Rohde-Brown for compelling stories and insightful information about making your relationships better, including your relationship with yourself. Dr. Rohde-Brown is a clinical psychologist with an integrative and multicultural perspective in her therapeutic practice. She's the author of the book Imagine Forgiveness and has created a series of guided imagery CDs developed in collaboration with Energy Music. In Emotional Pathways, she and her guests examine ways to work with anger and other difficult emotions and discuss how to truly live a life based on your core values. Learn how these things connect in the way we interact with others and ourselves, and discover how to foster joy, ultimately creating new emotional pathways. And now, Emotional Pathways with your host, Dr. Juliet Rohde-Brown.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Juliet Rohde-Brown. Welcome back this week. This week, we're going to be talking about creating new narratives through the experience of trauma. And our guest is Dr. Elizabeth Wolfson. Dr. Wolfson has a doctorate in social work, and she also has a psychotherapy practice, and she's a professor and chair of the master's department at Antioch University in Santa Barbara. And she has a very impressive background in the work that she has done in the communities with working with people who have been victims of trauma in many different ways and changing that around so that they can enter into a new story that actually emerged from the trauma. So let's welcome Dr. Elizabeth Wolfson for this week's program. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you? Thanks for being here.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Juliet. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So first of all, maybe for lay listeners who aren't in the psychotherapy professions or social work, I know we use the term trauma a lot, but maybe we'll just kind of come up with a definition of trauma that we would use for this 25 minutes or so that we're talking to share with the listeners. How would you define trauma, Elizabeth?
I would say that trauma is any major event that has had a negative and generally life-changing impact on the person who experienced it, and is often a feature that colors the rest of their life experience. And what we're talking about is the ways that trauma can color the future experiences, whether positive or negative.
Good. That's a really great definition.
There's been research that indicates that trauma can actually change the makeup of the brain.
Yes.
But we're not going to get into that today. So there are many definitions of trauma, but this is what I'm offering today.
Yes, many different ways that it can then manifest in our system and in our interactions and life. And what we're focusing on today is how it gets into our story about who we are, what we can expect in life, what we expect in others, in our relationships, and our narrative, the narrative that we tell ourselves about our identity, about what happened and where we can go with it. So maybe you can give some examples of how a story that is about being a victim, perhaps, can then change as a result of interacting in a different way in the world and courageously kind of stepping forward once again in even a public way to work with others who are struggling with their own stories And you do have some great examples of that, so I'd love for you to share.
Well, there are many examples in our lives that come to mind. There are victims, let's say, of plane crashes who then get involved in safety and air regulations, and all kinds of family survivors who lose families, say, through drunken driving. They often get involved in working against drunk driving or creating foundations or even helping build support groups. My experience and what I most comes to mind because of my experience has been with survivors of the Holocaust in World War II. And much of my professional work has been in working directly with survivors of all ages, their families, and now their grandchildren. So there's the legacy
really
of trauma that's multi-generational. But I think for now, what I'd like to speak more to is what you alluded to, Juliet, and how the person who directly experiences the trauma makes meaning of it, or how it shapes their life and their narrative, their life story. So if you'd like me to just go forward with that, I can talk a little bit about what I've seen in my firsthand experience working with survivors of the Holocaust.
I think that's a great place to start. I think people would be very interested in hearing about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Elizabeth.
And again, that could be a long discussion, so I won't get too far. But I think the first thing, the caveat that I have to say is that there's so many variations on the theme because people have experienced what they saw, what they witnessed, what they lost at all different ages. And there are many studies on the effect of trauma at different age levels and different stages of development. Also, there are variables around what was going on with your family at the time, what other experiences of trauma, what are your vulnerabilities before the trauma impacts. These are all different components that will shape a person's experience with the trauma, reaction to the trauma, and what they make of it moving forward. That being said, I want to respond to really your opening line, Juliet, about victims of trauma. And I would say that many of the survivors that I've worked with who witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust and lost family members rarely call themselves victims. And it's very interesting that they refuse to be victims. It's in part a matter of pride, and they don't want to take a victim stance. Because, in fact, they believe themselves to be very lucky that they did survive, and the victims are those who didn't survive, the family members who died, the communities who were slaughtered. So I just want to make that distinction.
Yes. Thank you.
And it's an interesting distinction as we talk about your life narrative, because I think it is very different to go through life feeling like a survivor of trauma rather than a victim of trauma.
Absolutely.
Huge. And again, I don't speak for all survivors, but I can say this has been predominantly what I've seen. Yeah. And then to go beyond that into what survivors have made of their stories, I think, there's so much variation here too, where there were some who decided to just move on by never talking about it and by putting it really buried in their past. And yet as psychologists, as therapists, we know that often manifests itself in other ways when we don't really process trauma, that it comes out in maybe dysfunctional family relationships or other problematic relationships or other interferences with functioning, sometimes through somatic physical manifestations. And yet, I wouldn't sit here and say that everybody who puts it behind them has some dysfunction as a result. Sometimes for us, the best way to cope with trauma is to defend against it and to try to move forward. So that's one way to make a new narrative. And there are other survivors who took the experience as a tool for instructing future generations and felt that part of the reason they survived was that they had to bear witness and that their meaning in life was created by telling the story of what happened by letting other people know what other human beings can do to each other, by sharing even the details of the atrocities so that the rest of humanity could understand what we're capable of, and in this way prevent it from happening. And there's a lot of emotion around the fact that people weren't able to prevent, human beings weren't able to prevent other human beings from harming each other the way and on the scale that the survivors and their families were harmed, or, I would really say the Jewish population was targeted during World War II by Hitler and the Nazis.
Yeah.
So informative, educating, that's one way to make a narrative.
Yeah, and I think that some of what you've witnessed along those lines has been quite extraordinary and quite meaningful for the future generations who have been graced with the experience of sitting with and hearing stories and sharing stories of surviving atrocities. And what a gift, to share with future generations. And maybe you'd like to speak a little bit about that and share some examples, if you can, with confidentiality and all of that taken into consideration.
Well, I feel fortunate, yes, to have been a part of this particular moment in history where the stories, and it's even hard to call them stories because they're the experiences. When we think of stories, we often think of a fable or a fairy tale.
Yeah, we think of fabrication, but yes. Well,
so the narrative, or the experiences of what happened to the survivors is really allowed itself to emerge, I think, in the past 20 years, because immediately in I'd say the first 20, 30 years post World War II, there was a lot of shutting down of telling about what happened. The survivors felt people didn't want to hear it when they immigrated to their new countries. It was so far-fetched. What they had seen was so far-fetched that from the human experience that people either didn't believe them or they didn't hear it. They would accuse them of imagining it or fabricating it, and mostly it was just too unbearable for other people to hear. And so many survivors who immigrated felt that it wasn't a welcome narrative to tell. Now, over time, I do think that has shifted, particularly as film started to depict what happened, because for some reason we as humans are able to see this on film much easier than we're able to actually hear it from a person. I think that's true of most atrocities. It's removed when it's on the film, but if you have a victim of say, the genocides in Rwanda standing in front of you telling about massacres, it's much harder to absorb.
It's much more raw, yes.
More raw, exactly. So with filmmaking and Steven Spielberg, a lot was opened up where suddenly these the witnesses to what happened were able to talk. And I was part of a project locally here in Santa Barbara, California, where part of a community building, a Jewish Federation of Greater Santa Barbara, we wanted to somehow commemorate what happened to local community members who lived in Santa Barbara and had survived the Holocaust. And when the project began, we had no idea how many Holocaust survivors actually lived here, because people don't walk around saying, "Oh, hello, I'm a survivor." It's not something that a lot of people talked about. So we did create a project where their narratives were depicted through photography. And in striking black and white contemporary photographs, their contemporary image was depicted. And then on another panel, which was in a book formation, so you could sort of open it up and interact with it, there were some photos of the relics they took with them or were able to salvage from their life at escaping, and then a little piece about what their story was. But
and I'd like to interrupt just for a moment here, because people may be interested in going online to see whatever is online now about that, because it's truly it's just beautiful. And if anyone
they go to Portraits of Survival, which is what it was called, And actually, it was the name itself is relevant to this discussion on narratives, because when we thought about what name to create, we called it Portraits of Survival: Life Journeys During the Holocaust and Beyond.
Yeah,
and
I
the
love
emphasis was on the beyond. In other words, what were these people's lives shaping into as they moved beyond the trauma that they experienced? And we depicted that in the photography too. So if you go online and Google Portraits of Survival, you'll find it.
And it's .com,
so thank you.
not .org, just so that people know.
.org.
Okay. It is
and so
.com, correct?
What evolved from that is that people were coming forward to tell their stories, and some of whom had never even told their children about their experiences during World War II, or that and would simply mention that, our family members died, but not talked about extermination or death marches or gas chambers or any of the details of that. So there were now family members who were being exposed to the trauma who had never heard this from their parents or grandparents. And so we had to do some work with the families around absorbing that, and also work with the survivors, who some of whom had never talked about it. What was it like now to publicly share your story? Because as the exhibit opened, people from all over the community and even from other parts of the country and the world were coming, and they wanted to hear directly from the survivors. So here's where the connection was made between the speaker and the listener, the person sharing the narrative and the person absorbing the narrative. And what I witnessed was an incredible bridge created between these two participants in the sharing of the story that was so powerful and so compelling and so life-changing for both the speaker and the listener. And I think this is what you're alluding to, Juliet, in terms of the young people, because they couldn't get enough of the story. It was almost, you had to skip a couple of generations, but middle school, teenage kids, even young adults, they just really wanted to hear more. They asked a lot of questions. They wanted to know, who was this person that could survive such horrible things? I mean, living in cells, marching through snow, watching your entire family killed, starving, all these things that are so far-fetched from our day-to-day lives for most of us. And the kids just needed to understand, well, how do you live past that? How is your life now? These were the kinds of questions we were getting, which is relevant to the topic we're looking at today. How do you create new narratives through the experience of trauma? Yeah. And so the survivors themselves had to reach into their souls and think about, well, how did I get through this, considering what I went through?
And what a learning experience for the young ones who, in some family systems, if someone is hit by a car, they take on more of a victim as opposed to a survival narrative. And so to hear from those who've been through such profound trauma and who see themselves as survivors and share their stories and do so in such a genuine and honest way can really shift a young person's mindset about how they look at their own identity, how they look at their own narrative, how they frame their own worldview about what can come out of difficult situations. When you hear from those who've been through some of the most difficult situations we can even imagine on this planet together. Yes, powerful.
Exactly. And so it was transformative for both the survivors and the listeners. And we brought in kids of all ages, all backgrounds. And here in Santa Barbara, we have a very high percentage of families who emigrate from Mexico. And so a lot of these kids, the Latino population, they were just glued to the story because it really resonated for them in terms of their own experience of having their lives and their families disrupted, having to move to a new culture, feeling that they could never quite fit in, and dealing on a daily basis with issues of discrimination and acculturation and trying to fit in and still holding memories of loss from their country of origin, and still also being entrenched, many of them, in the violence and challenges that they face in their lives of poverty, where many of them have families who are gang members, or are gang members, or have been in jail, or dealing with drugs, and so they've seen a lot of the ravages of violence as well. And when they heard how the survivors survived this, they would ask them, well, how did you do it, and how did you get past it, and how is it that you came here without an education, and now you got your medical degree, or you graduated college? They wanted to know, how do you do this? What is the resilience that gets you through the experience of trauma? And then some of them would say,
big word there.
What?
Yeah. Big word, resilience there. Important word there, resilience. Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And they wanted to know sort of what's the key, what's the clue to making it after all that happens to you. But they would also say to the survivors, if you could get yourself through all that, then I can get over my stuff too.
Exactly.
And that was the most poignant for us.
That's the most powerful piece of all of this, isn't it? And the powerful piece about sharing narratives, sharing experiences in the moment. And Elizabeth, you use the arts also as a medium in some of this as well. And it's, as you spoke earlier about some people also being able to experience some of what happened through film. And I know that you and I both share a deep regard for using creative avenues to help the process along of opening up dialogue and opening up a way for experience to happen together, shared, witnessed. So you might say a little bit about that too, as we have a few more minutes here.
Okay. Well, what we all know is that teenagers and kids, probably all ages, have a hard time with language when they're feeling that they need to express themselves most intensely and deeply and around areas of sensitivity, and that sometimes language doesn't do justice to what we want to say, and I think that's true for all of us. And art and different expressions of art is a very powerful way of expressing things that are inexpressible. And one of the magic things that we stumbled upon in this bringing together of survivors and other groups was that some of the dialogue could happen beyond language. We embarked on a project in which survivors and actually ex-gang members participated in several weeks of being together, sharing their life story, and then working on projects in which the young people would create some art piece that would express their life narrative and their experience of trauma and resiliency in the face of trauma, and how they would create new narratives from that. And so we gave them art materials, and we encouraged them to express themselves in any way they felt through an alternative means of expression, multimedia means. So film, photography, sculpture, a painting, poetry, music, dance. These were all things that the young people chose to create not only their reaction to hearing the survivors' narrative, but how they would build on that by expressing their own narrative. And so we did that and culminated in a community presentation where they presented their pieces. And we just heard wonderful things. We did this a few times, and the project continues at Portraits of Survival, where the kids would say, this was just such a powerful experience. It really changed my life. And the survivors, too, felt that their lives were changed by being able to make something of their trauma, as we say, creating a new narrative in which they could share and give a gift to to someone else whose life could be transformed. It was really quite magical.
Oh, surely. Oh, and when I've met some of the individuals who've been involved in your work, I see that. I see that in them. It's a wonderful thing to witness. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing all of this with the listeners today. I think that, and this week, for this whole week, they'll be able to have this as the featured listening. And it's particularly meaningful because this is airing the week that Holocaust Remembrance Day has fallen on, and so particularly poignant.
Yeah, and I feel very appreciative to be able to talk about this wonderful project at this week of commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day. I do hope that other people who want to consider this kind of project will contact me, and I can certainly help. And I just encourage this. This is something that can be replicated in communities everywhere and between communities where terrible things have happened, and beautiful things can be made out of that.
I love the message, but even between communities, that's powerful. So Elizabeth, we haven't given any contact info per se for you yet, and I'd like to know how you would like to share about how people can contact you. Is it at Antioch, or is that the best way? Or share that.
People can just find me at Antioch University, Santa Barbara, California. My email, Wolfson, WOLFSON, @antioch.edu. And they can also look at this project and the exhibit that I'm describing, again, at portraitsofsurvival.org. And,
it is .org. I made a mistake earlier and said .com.
Yeah.
.org, everybody. Remember that.
And I'm happy
Antioch
to answer questions.
Antioch.edu.
Excuse me?
I was giving you the Antioch website in case that went by very quickly and they wanted to find you also. You can go to antioch.edu or Antioch SB for Santa Barbara.edu. Either way, you'll be able to find Elizabeth there as well. And then go ahead, because I was interrupting you when you were giving some other information.
No, I just want to say I'm happy to answer questions and share this gift. I feel myself that I've been very fortunate to experience this new narrative of engaging with these groups to bring something new and inspiring to the world. So I'm appreciative.
Great, thank you. And we're very appreciative to have you here today. And again, the topic was creating new narratives through trauma, and a particularly traumatic event and the personal experiences that came out of that event that were shared with others is what we focused on today, and that was the Holocaust, and it falls on the week of Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is particularly meaningful. So thank you, listeners, for being here at Emotional Pathways. And again, this is Dr. Juliet Rohde-Brown, and we've had with us today Dr. Elizabeth Wolfson, and we're on webtalkradio.net, and we truly thank you for listening and look forward to next week. Thank you. Until then.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining this Imagery International podcast. The music in this piece is provided by Shantha Shri. Find out more about our membership benefits, including our quarterly journal, at imageryinternational.org. Thank you for listening.